Welcome to Where Parents Talk. My name is Lianne Castelino. Our guest today is a father of four and a grandfather of three. He is a psychologist in private practice, an author of more than a dozen books, a lecturer, and a graphic artist. Carl Pickhardt has written books spanning conflict and communication, discipline and divorce, and the adolescent years, among other topics. He joins us today from Austin, Texas. Thank you so much for being here, Carl.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for giving me a call. Yeah.
So I wanted to start, first of all, it's a word that many parents, it's probably the first word that many parents use with their young children. And ironically, it's also probably the very first word a lot of toddlers use with their
Right,
parents.
right,
We're talking about the word no. Can you
right.
tell us from the perspective of a psychologist, why is the word no important?
Well, no is the boundary setting or the limit setting word. And it has to do with trying to keep ourselves clear of what we don't want in our lives. And the little child, of course, learns it very early. The kid, first they kind of swipe their hand away, and the parent, says, well, instead of trying to hit me, say the word no, and I'll understand that there's something else you'd like me to do. Uh, but setting limits is a very, very important skill, both in childhood and particularly in adolescence, when all of a sudden the demands dramatically increase.
Let's talk about those adolescent years. Obviously, so many different things going on many levels.
Right?
What does the power of saying no mean in those years for both parent and child?
Well, it's a transition for a lot of parents. It is for the kid, but for the parents, childhood very often is the kind of the yes saying years. That's the age of command, where by and large the child actually believed that my parents can make me and stop me. The adolescent is no longer suffering from that illusion. The adolescent knows that you cannot make me, you cannot stop me without my consent. And so now the power of no becomes protective, and the kid becomes very often more resistant, because now what they're trying to do is they're trying to protect their freedom, and they do that by trying to set limits with parents, and they do it by actively with argument and disagreement, and passively with delay, and all of that is this gathering of power that adolescence is. It's the coming of age passage. And I think the goals of that passage are twofold. One is there's the goal of differentiating from how I was as a child and you, my parents, and becoming my own individual. And the other is independence, becoming, my own free choosing, self-governing individual. And the kid is growing on both those fronts, and they're pushing to get those freedoms on the one hand. And when parents are seen as restricting those freedoms with a no, then the kid can feel frustrated. And then what happens sometimes is the parent gets frustrated back, because now they see the kid as being oppositional, and sometimes it's harder for them to get their way. And so that's why you tend to get more disagreement in adolescence. And that's why the management of parenting adolescents very often is learning the management of effective disagreement.
I'd like to pick up on that point. Because my next question was going to be, how does a parent with a preteen, teen, young person, adolescent manage that successfully?
Well, the key phrase is, let's talk about it. Communication is how you try to stay connected while adolescence is growing you apart, which is what it's meant to do. And so disagreement is simply an opportunity for discussion. How that discussion is conducted, the choice of language, that also may need to be discussed. I don't yell at you, and I don't want you to yell at me. I don't do hurtful words with you. I don't want you to do hurtful words with me. But I will, I can promise you this, I will be firm where I have to. I will be flexible where I can. I will listen to whatever you have to say. And and I will, discuss with you whatever we need to discuss. And that's sometimes parents, they get weary, they get offended by the opposition, and then they get weary of the resistance. But I guess one thing to remember is that the question I sometimes ask beleaguered parents is, which would you rather have? Would you rather graduate from your care a shutting up child who doesn't know how to say no and doesn't feel comfortable doing so? Or would you like to graduate from your care a speaking up child who knows how to be able to set limits in relationships for themselves? And most parents would choose the second.
So let's break that down a little bit further. First of all, what would you say to parents who, let's say, haven't had the most communicative relationship with their child
Right.
up to that adolescent period? And there's the natural withdrawing that adolescents will go through.
Right.
And so there's a lot going on there. What would you say to them in terms of opening up the lines of communication as you described?
Well, I think by talking about communication, by saying this may be a time now where we have more times when it's harder to reach agreement and harder to get along. And that's okay. That's part of the growing apart that adolescence is about. And I want to respect that. And I want you to respect that. And I want us to do that by being able to talk out any difference or any disagreement that comes between us. And I will work with you where I can, and I'll be firm where I have to, and I'll be flexible where I can, and I will always explain, what it is, I want to happen or not want to happen, and why that is.
It's interesting. In a recent article that you wrote for Psychology Today, you say that it can be hard to say no, but life gets harder if you can't say no.
Absolutely.
Could you explain that a bit?
Well, I think it's hard to say no because very often it evokes displeasure in the other person, or sometimes disagreement or anger or frustration. But if you don't say no, then you have no boundaries. You have no boundaries in the relationship, and relationships are about setting safe and responsible and caring boundaries. And those change all the time as the child grows. And I mean, that's what the parents saying is like, I will work with you where I can, and I hope you will work with me where you can. And most of the time we'll be able to come up with a set of boundaries that works for both of us. But as you grow, you're going to be pushing in new and different ways that neither of us know about. And those will be kind of fresh experiences, where we have to test our capacity to be able to talk out, differences that may be offensive or scary or whatever to us. And that's okay.
Your perspective is so interesting because, you were likely raised a certain way, you raised your children a certain way, and now
Right,
you've got grandchildren that are being raised, in
right, right,
2021
right.
completely differently. So
Absolutely.
I wonder how much has changed when it comes to saying no, setting boundaries through all those generations. Plus, you have the perspective of being a psychologist who's written books on the topic.
Well, I think, remember, if I go back to my parents, the screen my parents came up with was the movie screen. I came up with the TV screen. My kids came up with the computer screen. And now all of a sudden I'm parenting in two worlds, the offline and the online. And I have to be able to set limits or help set limits on both. And I mean, it's a huge area of a complicated area of how do I help my child who is spending a lot of their lifetime online set safe boundaries for themselves so they do not inadvertently expose themselves to the risk of getting hurt some ways, or they start communicating in ways that in fact get them hurt. Uh, so that it's just more complicated now, the setting of boundaries, because it's two worlds, not one.
So I guess in many ways, though, even though it's more complicated, would you say it's even more necessary?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes. It takes it's hugely complicated parenting now, because by and large the kids know more about the internet world than parents do, and they're more skilled at navigating it. Uh, and so one of the things that, again, adolescents are trying to do is they're trying to differentiate and detach. So they're trying to set up their own individual life experience independent of their parents. And what parents, I think, are trying to say is, look, we want to, when I ask you about how was your day, I'm asking two questions. How was your offline day at school? And how was your online day, and what was going on? And parents have to be able to share. They have to model, this is what I did with my online day. What did you do with your online day? And you have to be able to share all that stuff. And part of the growth of child to adolescent is not just going from the age of command to the age of consent, but going from the age of being easily known to becoming much more private. And that privacy is meant to, protect it's the need not to be known. And what parents are saying is, I realize I can't know it all, and I don't expect you to tell me everything, but I do hope that you will tell me everything that directly affects your welfare and your well-being. That is, if you were in danger or in threat, or seriously unhappy, these are things I need to know so I can be there for you. Sometimes kids, you get a teenager say, my parents keep best in the dark. And what I try to tell them is, no, they do not keep best in the dark. You put your parents in the dark, and you know what they're going to do? They're going to take their ignorance and they're going to imagine the worst. And based upon that, very often false information, they're going to come down and be more restrictive and more negative than they would otherwise be if, in fact, they actually knew some of what was going on. You are better off having informed parents than ignorant parents.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because here we are, everything that you're talking about in 2021 with the societal discourse going on around speaking up,
Right.
sharing, whether it's mental health issues or other issues. There's
Right.
a big a focus and emphasis on people to speak up. You've got a pandemic that has forced people in front of screens and maybe thrown some of the limits and barriers that parents would like to have in place right out the window. So you've got a confluence of factors really affecting the ability to do a lot of what you're saying. So what would you say to parents currently finding it hard to find that balance as they try to raise their adolescent children?
Yeah, but that's what you just said is a beautiful statement. I mean, that's the statement to make. I am having, as your parent, I am having a hard time trying to balance out, how much information to exchange, how much I need to know, how much you need to tell me. And it's all been complicated for this, this crazy pandemic world that is, all of a sudden created in some ways more intimacy than we would normally have as a family, because we're the only company we have. And so, I mean, really, it sounds so simple and it's so complicated, but parents and kids need to be able to talk about whatever's going on. Can we talk about it? I know you're unhappy, or you're angry, or you're disappointed, or you're frustrated. Can you give me some words to describe what's going on, so to help me better understand, so I can better work with you in a way that works for both of us? And you just got to keep coming out to talk. If you don't have the talking out, and then what happens is you start getting more acting out, and that doesn't serve well at all. Sometimes I think what happens is I think parents of adolescents tend to be more anxious than parents of children. And I think that's honorably come by. After all, the kid is moving out into the larger world under more influence of peers, and all of a sudden they're interested in experimenting with more, and and parents are feeling more and more out of control as I think of it as the public parent. The public parent takes over in adolescence. The public parent is advertising, media, all of a sudden the internet, all of a sudden childhood seems so sheltered and so simple and so secure. And now it's been blasted. And all of a sudden you have this overwhelming influence coming in, particularly in the online world. And for some reason, I don't know, I think it's changing. I think the "how was your day" question, which referred to the offline world, the online, applying that to online experience, I think is getting more common, but it's still harder to do. It feels like people treat online as private or as something we don't talk about, and yet it's so massively influential. That's why I think parents need to talk about their online life with their kids so that they can legitimize that. I mean, what we give our kids is who and how we are. That's primarily what we give. And that's the model, that's the example. And if we routinely talk about, the complexity, particularly the online complexity of our lives, the kid can talk about the online complexity of their lives. If we can talk about how we got in difficulty online, then maybe the kid can learn from that and not make the same, choices that we did.
I'm curious. There are going to be parents who listen and watch this who maybe have been just generally lax in setting limits and barriers over time.
Right?
It hasn't been a priority. Maybe they're not the disciplinarian in the family. Maybe they rely on the school, the babysitter, whomever else to do it.
Right.
Yeah, and then there's an element of guilt involved when you have to maybe look at putting your foot down and saying no.
Right.
What would you say to those parents about how they can now go about establishing those barriers that maybe they hadn't laid the foundation for before?
Well, you're not bound to continue a pattern of behavior, that may have been all right in childhood, but seems less workable now. And parents could say, as time change, you change, I change, and we change. And the rules governing a family change, and we have to keep up with this. And so, what you're coming back to is that adolescence is not just how a child changes on the way to adulthood. It's how parents change in response, and it's how that relationship changes. And I think if you understand that change is occurring in all three spheres of life, then you can say, well, let's talk about that. And it may be, in elementary school, you and I didn't talk that much about, what I wanted you to do or not to do, because you pretty much operated within the family limits. But I understand you're 16 years old now, and you spend a lot of time with peers and out in the world, and you have a larger view of things. And, now, it seems like when I set a limit of some kind, it feels frustrating to you. But, again, obviously I'm in counseling, so, I believe in communicating and talking. But, I think, I've worked with a lot of parents and adolescents, and getting them to talk together about whatever it is. It makes it easier to work with what they've got. I've had lots of kids who say, all right, I'll do what you want, or I won't do, what you don't want me to, but at least I have had my say. That's huge. The kid wants their say. Parents have to be willing to hear that say. By the same token, the kid is not lying. I am not 8 years old anymore. You've got to loosen some of these limits that you have on me, and I know that may be hard for you, but you're going to have to risk giving me more freedom than you have before. And then the parent says, well, then I want a contract. If I give you more freedom, what are you going to give me? What capability, what responsibility, what evidence are you going to give me that you are ready to manage that in a way that won't hurt you? And that's a dialogue that you can have. And so you get some horse trading going on, which is fine.
Anything else that you'd like to add in terms of tips and strategies for parents of adolescents navigating this, again, very tumultuous, busy, rewarding? I mean, there's all kinds of adjectives you can throw in there, but this key developmental phase of their lives.
Well, I think, yes, I think lastly, I would say that remember that as a parent, your relationship with your adolescent has formative value. So that, how the adolescent is with you is going to, in a lot of ways, contribute to how they're going to be in their adult relationships. If you are the kind of parent who said, I will not stand taking no for an answer, so the kid doesn't say no to you, you put that kid at risk of getting used to relationships where they can't say no. And now all of a sudden in their adult relationships, lo and behold, they get in a relationship with somebody who dominates them to their cost. And that is not a good deal. That's what I meant earlier. I think you really want to graduate from your care a young person who is comfortable speaking up, setting limits, saying no, and not being afraid that if I say no, I will displease and I will jeopardize the relationship. No, I mean, that's why you try to, again, in counseling, I guess, but, I don't see disagreement as a bad thing. I see disagreement as a way of taking a look at issues around independence and individuality and working these things out. And you do that by talking these things out. And that's what you're trying to give. You're trying to give your kid, talking skills. Every opportunity that when you say a no, that's an opportunity about talking about something that's important, particularly if the kid finds that no difficult.